This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me.
Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to the 38th Right and Left Discussion Forum. The purpose of our discussion forum is to demonstrate that civility matters and that it is the backbone of a peaceful and prosperous culture. Without it, neither peace nor prosperity can last. Today we're going to depart from our normal format of discussing one topic only, for which the panelists had an opportunity to prepare. Instead, we'll select from a variety of topics at random and invite the panel to share their first impressions completely off the cuff. Our panel today, beginning on my left, is Bryan Laubaugh, President of R&B Financial Services. On his left is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist. On his left, filling in for Jerry Ritzman, is Major Tom Grace, commander of the Wadsworth Post of the Salvation Army. On his left, filling in for Patty Haskins, is Dave Scott. Dave is a recently retired writer from the Akron Beacon Journal. From this point on, I'm going to pull out topics one at a time, and our panelists are free to contribute as they please. The very first topic, I haven't decided even yet. Back in the 50s, I remember a lot of ministers, particularly from the South, were declaring that rock and roll music was going to cause young people to become sexually promiscuous and antisocial. When you think over the last 60 years, first of all, do you think there has been a moral decline in our country? And has rock and roll music had anything to do with it?
Yes and no.
Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, I think at least we see on the surface, we have so much increased communication that we see all the decline that goes on. I'm not sure that it's, you know, look at the 20s, look at the Roaring 20s. Mm-hmm. You know, there's this famous quote by Socrates about how bad the young people are doing. I don't think that's any difference. Did rock and roll cause it? Rock and roll may have been a symptom, some of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll culture. Now, as you know, I'm invested in this. My oldest son joined a rock and roll band in high school. He had one going, and if it wasn't a school night, we allowed him to go out and play. They were playing in bars when they were well underage. I don't know if they were drinking.
Yeah, my son too.
Your son too, yes. Yeah. So, and I have a son now who's actively in a nationwide touring rock and roll band. He's a drummer. These are great guys. They avoid all of that.
When you think about the teenage pregnancy rate and
which is going down, by the way.
Gangs, yes. You can look at our culture and say there has been a decline in values. If rock and roll music didn't cause it, what did?
Well, I don't know whether it was rock and roll or not, but I think the setting of rock and roll, you know, promotes a culture of at least throwing away your morals for a little while, okay? But I don't think that you can totally contribute to rock and roll. I think there's a lot of going on in terms of moral decline in our rock and roll as much as media.
I would agree with that. You're talking about the milieu. I'm recalling one of the early concerts I attended with my son's band. It was in a basement club in New York City, and I walked back to the restroom and I had to hold my breath. I would have gotten high on the way to the bathroom. So that environment was there. However, jazz clubs in the 20s and 30s are the same way.
Yeah, I agree.
There's a change in morals, you know, at least, but not necessarily a decline in morals because people adopt different principles. You know, the movie Reds, which was about the 20s, as I recall, there were a couple people there talking about how they thought there was more sex going on back then. Certainly now there are a lot of people whose value says that unmarried pregnancies are not a shame anymore. Depending on how you feel about that, whether it's a decline or a change. Things have changed all along. I mean, how did we get through the Victorian era The species progressed through that, even though there were all kinds of stigmas involved there.
Okay, so Bill Haley in the comments did not start a decline in our culture then.
At most, they were a symptom.
Okay. Okay, I've got another question for you, and this really affects Ohio and the Defense Department. Before leaving as Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta said that we are paying for an awful lot of weapons systems that we don't want, particularly the Abrams tank renovation program that takes place in Lima, Ohio. He said they're bringing us tanks that we don't need, and we already have several thousand of them that are sitting idle. The explanation for that and for other weapons systems that are unneeded by the Pentagon is that if we discontinue those programs, it would cause a large amount of unemployment. So, the question is, creating unneeded weapons systems for the whole purpose of keeping people employed in this country, is that justified?
I would say no.
I think what happens is politicians get involved in the process, and if we take them out of it and let the military decide what they need and what type of systems they need, we really would be a lot farther along. If it's not building a tank, maybe there's another type of system that could be used to fill that void. But obviously, with the system we have, politicians get involved, they have constituents, and they want to bring home some sort of project that keeps people employed, keeps people happy, and so often they're behind the curve. And this is one example with a tank that obviously might be a little outdated for the mission, but there's other pieces of equipment I'm certain of that could be used to fill that void. So we need to really look at who's running the program and let the Pentagon make those types of decisions instead of politicians that have very little military experience deciding what type of system would be best for their local constituency.
Very true. There's a member of a peace church. I would like to see a lot of those resources put someplace else.
To understand that issue totally, though, you have to bring it closer to home and ask what would happen if this came about regarding Loral in Akron and say it threatened 400 jobs. You might hear a little different tune from the local folks under those circumstances. So it may seem rational anywhere else to suggest, well, we'll close this plant and put the money into roads or something like that. But when it's your town and it's your jobs, it changes your perspective a little bit.
I think it's a matter of choosing your poison. Do you stop producing? Do you stop using outdated equipment for the sake of getting rid of how many jobs? I think the other issue is that it's a hot button for a politician. He wants to keep his constituents happy, and he wants to keep getting elected. And I think it's a system that's broken.
Yeah, it's a bipartisan issue in Ohio. We have a Republican governor, one Republican senator, and a Democrat senator, and they all support keeping these weapon systems in Dayton, Ohio, and in Lima going, even though the Pentagon said we don't need the weapons, we can't use them. We already have too many. Let's see if we can't segue very neatly into okay, here's one. Here's one. And particularly now, when we look around the world and look at what's going on in the Mideast and other places, what is the responsibility of the United States of America, the world's only remaining superpower, in trying to maintain the peace and at least put an end to things like the massacres going on in Iraq now by ISA? Does the United States have a responsibility to the world to intervene in these conflicts?
I think that leadership really would make a difference when you are the only real remaining superpower. It's our responsibility to provide leadership to these countries. I believe our way of government, with all its flaws, is probably the best way to govern people. Democracy works no matter where you're at. I firmly believe that. And that's a message that these countries need to hear. And it's not just putting boots on the ground or providing them with weapons, but providing a clear pathway for people that want freedom, that we would support those people and help them at the end of the day have more of a representation in their governments. We seem to get so far down the road and things get a little sticky and we pull out. And we see that in the Middle East. We have to understand the actors that we're playing with, and a lot of times they don't think the way we think, and that's the disconnect.
Are all peoples capable of democracy? Does it really work for everyone?
I would say yes.
Tough question for a guy like me. You can't win peace with bombs. On the other hand, you need, as you say, there's some issues of protecting innocent people, protecting minorities who are being at the verge of being exterminated. We do have our own extermination of minorities, if you look at the history of this country. But it's a tough question for me. I'm not sure how to answer that.
I'm not sure if we are legally responsible to do that. I think we go back to the question of, is rock and roll changed our society? I think there are ethical issues. I think there are moral issues. I just heard again this morning, the hundreds of children who are having their heads chopped off, okay? I mean, at what point does a nation or a world accept that? And I believe that what makes our country as great as it is that we have the willingness to do that. Does it come at great cost? Absolutely, absolutely. But I think at some point, if nobody steps in, there's only going to be more chaos.
Ron, you're thinking and thinking and thinking, and I've been meaning to ask you this as a pacifist for the longest time. Can you stand by and watch all these Christians be slaughtered?
Probably not. Probably not. I'm a personal pacifist in terms of direct assaults on me. As far as what I think our country's responsibilities are, responsibility of protecting somebody else, I'm more conflicted about that. I truly am.
If you look at the experiment, if you will, of the United States, I don't believe there's been any other government or people that have done what we've done and had the success that we've done, that we've had. Obviously there are flaws in anything, but it certainly isn't what you see in other countries. And I think, as probably Tom thinks, that we do have a moral obligation to help and create an environment for those people to make those types of decisions. I believe that most, if not all, people want to be free. And I feel that this country is free. I mean, we can do whatever we want to do within the confines of the law, but when you have other countries that people are running and leaving their countries because they're afraid that a group of people, they're going to get slaughtered. I haven't felt that ever. So I believe that we are an exceptional country. That message is a good message. There are some flaws in it, but I think it works in any country. I believe most men and women want to be free.
There's a cliche I like, with great freedom comes great responsibility, and we have that. Absolutely have that.
Well, you mentioned flaws in the system, and I'd like to bring up one of them. We have a United States Congress with an approval rating probably in the single digits by now. I'm not
I heard some
sure.
congressman the other day said we have a lower approval rating than headlights. So he said that on the floor of the Senate.
Wow.
Now let's not call the politicians headlights. But let's keep it above. Come on, Ron.
I saw earlier this week there was a poll that was done, and for the very first time, a majority of people disapprove of their own congressman. That's never happened before. Most of the time, people will disapprove of Congress, but they like their guy. And that in this case, it's still pretty close. I mean, it was like 47% approved of their congressman. And that one of the reasons that we have this kind of a problem where everybody hates Congress but they like their own congressman is redistricting. And I don't know how it works in most states, but in Ohio, every 10 years, the company in power, or the party in power, gets the opportunity to redistrict so that to their advantage. And we wind up with a lot of districts that are pretty safe for whatever party, for whatever party has been in power for the longest time. And we've talked about that before on this panel, about the problems of redistricting.
It doesn't have to be that way.
Tell me about it.
Justice Stevens has suggested, in a book called Six Amendments, has suggested a constitutional amendment that would require a much fairer way of divvying up the districts. The state of Iowa has successfully made competitive districts throughout its state through a state amendment. Both parties have done this in the past, but it's not necessary.
The last time we did it here in Ohio, I can't remember what year it was.
Well, it was just 2 years ago.
Was it 2 years ago?
Well, yeah, as a consequence of the 2010 decennial census.
Okay, and anyway, there was a plan put forth that sounded good at the beginning, but when you read through it, it was still manipulative of the system, and was still going to cause a lot of disparity, and it was voted down.
There was a suggestion made to both parties in the mid 2000s, and the Democrats rejected it and came to regret that. So yeah, there have been plans. It's just that getting both parties to agree to it has been difficult in Ohio.
So what it takes then is an initiative on the part of the citizens, and you can do that with a referendum in Ohio,
Yeah, I
can't you?
think so.
Well, we're no longer playing to the middle. We play to the extremes.
Right.
And that's the problem that I
point.
see. I think that what they've done in Iowa is a workable solution. I don't see any benefit of these wide swings in the types of people you get because of redistricting that are running for re-election. You know, I think we have to start looking towards the middle, and that not only goes for the Republicans, but it goes for the Democrats. You know, we have to look and see where can we build consensus, and redistricting is probably one of those areas. If cooler heads prevail, and you know, we ferret out these people with these wild hairs that have a tendency to really swing things, and then the other side is saying, well, wait till we get the opportunity.
Right.
Yeah.
You know,
I agree. Brian, I totally agree with you. I think you started this topic with the displeasure of the people, okay? I think these issues go hand in hand, because we've long gone away from public servants serving the public, okay? And so basically what happens now is they're serving their parties or whatever, and we aren't being served. Look, I'm in a business where I may only have 12% of my congregation's approval on any Sunday, okay, depending on what I say. But the reality is that if we're not really being considered, then people are always going to be upset, and approval ratings are always going to be low, because I don't ever feel as if, for the most part, our politicians are serving us until it's time to be elected, and then they're going to jump into their area and say, what can I do for you? Well, the reality is govern. That's what you can do, but govern from a sensible point of view. I mean, how many times do we hear things and say, there's not even common sense in that. There's not common sense.
Yeah.
So
The way it is now does not serve civility, because so many districts are largely one party,
Yes.
and the primary becomes the important
Yes.
forum for all of that.
Absolutely.
And
Good point.
primaries are places where party loyalists are more likely to vote than those who are in the center or elsewhere.
Particularly in the Ohio
And so
system, where-
they wind up appealing to the fringes of the party. And those are the folks who get riled up by extreme rhetoric.
It seems like one of the reasons for that difficulty is that we have congressmen that are constantly running for office, because they're up every 2 years. And to what extent do you think this might be remedied by expanding that to 4 years or even more?
I think that would help, as long as you don't get too extreme with it, you know, like a 10-year term or something.
right.
But yeah, because, well, any of the politicians, you know, as you say, their first job of a politician is to get reelected. You know, it's pretty
It
true.
starts
I think.
over almost immediately.
Well, do you think the Senate is more civilized and responsive than the House?
I guess the question to me would be, do the senators better represent the desires of their electorate than the Congress?
Well, remember now, you know, contrary to that poll result that I'm not familiar with that you gave about people favoring their own congressman, the re-election rate for congressmen is enormous.
Yes.
And you know, if they have a longer term, you're going to have fewer shots at expressing your dissatisfaction with those folks. So that's the great conflict. You know, people say, I hate Congress, but then they re-elect their own representative. And what it really means, if they were to get down to the nitty-gritty, I believe, and sometimes the polls do reflect this, the person hates your congressman, not mine.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, and I think it speaks to a lack of engagement on the general public's part. I think we've become almost numb to some things, and so we can't change it, so we put up with it or ignore it. And when it's time to elect, well, you know, that's, yeah, I want to vote, but.
John has spoken to that. We've talked about that a little bit too. Is it just a good thing for everybody to vote if you don't know what you're voting for?
Right, I agree.
I understand.
Firesign Theater had a comedy record back in the 70s, and they pointed out something they called the tomb of the unregistered voter. An example of spending that you know, common sense people would have declined.
Well, as long as we're beating up on Congress, let me throw another topic on the table that's bothered me for quite some time. And that is that the congressmen are immune from the insider trading laws. They are allowed to go ahead and buy and sell stock based on information they have on pending legislation. And that there have been a number of poorly written regulations trying to control that over the years, but they always have so many loopholes and outs that it doesn't really matter. That there are some 2,800 people, congressmen and their staffs and all that now, that are able to buy and sell stock based on insider information and make a lot of money.
Well, I think there's an easy answer to that, and that is whatever laws Congress passes applies to Congress with full effect, and even more so.
Didn't they pass a law like that a few years ago and then found a way around it?
Well, sure. Well, sure. They're the ones writing the laws. I mean, you know, we have these expansive regulatory rollouts, Dodd-Frank. We have Sarbanes-Oxley, and it really is difficult for companies to operate within that regulatory environment, but we've seen those issues that come up when there's no regulation. But when Congress exempts themselves from just some of the basics, we can talk about the Affordable Care Act. You know, there's exemptions flying all over the place. So I think that if we're going to deal with the public servant should be required to do everything that they're asking the public to.
You might divide people into three categories: those who break rules, those who follow rules, and those who make rules necessary. And this is an example of those who make rules necessary. You know, probably the first step in this would be to make them fully disclose all of their holdings, so that when they regulate the cable industry and then buy cable stock the next day, everybody knows about it. And when that happens, the need for this rule will be clear.
In fact, I was reading something where there's something like that in effect, but when a congressman buys stock, they have to make a public disclosure of it, but it gets buried in among thousands of others. And if somebody wanted to, they have to go through like all the stock trades on the New York Stock Exchange, you know, for a month to find out did.
And some agencies do that.
Yeah.
But
Well, I think it's a conflict of interest, period. If it's public service, guess what? If you're in office for 4 years, all of your investments stop. But because that's the only way. Now, do I think they can get around that? Of course. A family member may invest or whatever,
Yes.
but I think saying that at least sets a standard.
Yeah.
It sets a standard.
Well, here's the solution. Maybe what they'll do is, you know, for some of the wealthy ones, what they do is they take their assets and they let the government manage it for that 2 or 4 or 6 or however long they're in office. Let the government manage their assets like they manage Social Security, like they manage all the other programs, and that'll wake some people up. You know, if you have to turn over, if you're gonna work for the government, you let them manage your legacy, and we'll see how you know, they start changing some of the rules.
Especially
Well,
when there isn't
Martha's-
much left.
Exactly.
There'll be a lot of people declining participation.
Yeah, exactly. They want to exempt out of that.
They threw Martha Stewart in jail, not for insider trading, but for lying about it. Can you imagine
Yeah.
that the self-righteousness of Congress throwing somebody in jail for lying to them?
Yeah.
Anyway, we picked on politicians for a little bit. Now let's try corporate executives. A hot topic these days is corporate inversion, and I'm sure that you are very, very familiar with that. But in case you're not, it is a company reestablishing a headquarters outside the United States in order to avoid 35% corporate taxes, and that it's become a hot button issue for the administration. But as it turns out, when you take all of the companies over the last, I forget, 20 years that have done such a thing, it has cost the Internal Revenue Service about $10 billion a year in lost taxes. Okay, I'm not going to give you the other side of that. Let's talk about that. How do you feel about an American corporation transferring their headquarters out of the country to avoid taxes?
Isn't it the American way?
Pretty good business.
You know, I mean,
pretty good business.
It's business. You have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholder to do the best thing for them. And when the government sets up these wacky rules and regulations and a tax code that's how many pages long?
17,000?
17,000 pages long.
And nobody understands it.
But there are people that understand it, and that's why companies pay very sharp management consultants and CPAs. They go in and they ferret out those opportunities, those loopholes, and you know that's what you get.
And that 35% figure is misleading because so many exceptions are written right into the code.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Very few companies actually pay that, and that's only probably a result of their lack of a political fund going on.
Yeah.
35 is low, isn't it?
Well,
I mean,
you know,
compared to what it used to be.
yeah, but we're still the highest corporate tax rate
Yeah.
in the world. I think we're now at the top, even
Before
greater.
the exemptions come in.
Before the exemptions
Yeah.
come in.
Okay, we got to
but-
call a
so-
halt to all of that because I need to get this quote in, and we've done it before. And this is a quote from my son, Adam. Adam is a music director at a high school, and he had sent this message on Facebook to his students one time. He said, "Listen and adjust. Blend your tone, balance your volume. As I reflect on ensemble performance fundamentals, it strikes me how easily these concepts apply to our daily lives. By listening, adjusting, blending our tone, and balancing our volume, we create a community with similar goals and priorities." Thank you, Adam.
Amen.
Very good.